Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody. I don't know if it's as cold where you are as it is here in frozen Yorkshire, but it's certainly very, very cold indeed. What I'm going to do tonight is to focus on a number of things drawn from numerous sources, some of them perhaps slightly controversial, which are looking at likely developments in the future. And by the future, I mean in the next few years, but also much longer than that, over the coming decades and perhaps even longer than that. So many of these developments are actually interconnected and they're not standing in isolation. So a little over 2 years from now, a number of important events will take place. The year 2025 seems to be, for all sorts of reasons, quite a crucial year and an important time. In the autumn of 2025, the Theosophical Society will celebrate its 150th anniversary. As you'll recall, it was formed in 1875 in New York by Madame Blavatsky, Colonel Olcott, and others. And it's been absolutely pivotal in introducing key esoteric ideas, many of them from the East, into Western thought for the first time. Such notions which are now widely accepted as karma and reincarnation, the unity and ubiquity of life, and the nature of consciousness, and also our makeup as human beings. We're not just skin and bone, we're many other things besides. Now, I'm not an astrologer, but I understand that astrologically and cyclically, 2025 might prove to be a crucial year. And that's because the planet Pluto makes the transition from Capricorn into Aquarius. If I've got that wrong, I'm sure the astrologers later will remind me of that. But Pluto's interesting because it has a 248-year orbit of Sun, and it has, according to my astrological friends whom I've spoken to about this, it has a powerful transformative effect for better or for worse, and it represents power and control. However, when people get more and more power, they frequently end up actually destroying themselves with that power. Now, Pluto can also signify war and conflict, something which I'll deal with in a little while. And it's often described also as the planet of death. Now, the last time there was this configuration, 248 years ago, it was the time when the United States declared its independence from Britain in 1776. And of course, Pluto is also epitomized in the Greek myth when he captures and rapes Persephone and takes her to the underworld before she becomes rescued by her mother, Ceres. Now, another important development is said to take place in 2025. And this is the start of a cycle of the fourth ray of harmony through conflict, which apparently has been out of incarnation, out of influence for a long time. And this is quite interesting because this is the ray of art and beauty, and the ray which also is said to have a very close affinity to humanity itself. And also in 2025, there may well be an important once in a century event which could shape world events for the next 100 years. This is quite controversial, but it's the so-called Conclave of Masters, which is said to meet in the 25th year of every century in the Council of Shambhala, as it's known. And it makes key decisions about the directions that humanity will take over the course of the next century. This council consists of what we in the Theosophical Society call the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood or the Great White Brotherhood, but there are other names for it as well. And this, of course, is that hidden hierarchy of advanced beings who are controlling the world and governing the world to some extent, but doing it covertly rather than through any direct means. So we're going to explore the implications of this and how it ties in with other major developments, such as the formation of new esoteric networks of people in the world and the possible re-emergence and reopening of the mystery schools of old. So what we need to do to begin with is just kind of set the scene and do the current situation report and assess precisely where we are at the moment. And the truth seems to be that it's a very long time since the world was the way it is now, for all kinds of reasons, psychically and otherwise. Many people would say that it's 12,000 years or so since things were like this. And this was the time of the collapse of Atlantis, which, like all civilizations in the past, now, and in the future, will eventually vanish and collapse in on itself. So are we facing a similar collapse, or is it merely another regular cyclic readjustment on this earth? There's an awful lot of doom and gloom and stuff around at the moment, and I'm going to try not to dwell on that too much, but I think we have to accept the world is at some kind of pivot point. Despite all the external appearances in recent decades and centuries, humanity has in fact made great strides in evolving both mentally and, to a lesser extent, a much lesser extent, spiritually. We're much smarter than we used to be, but our mental evolution is concentrated very much in our lower rather than our higher minds. And also this intellectualization has to some extent had an impact on spiritual progress. And much of our thinking, of course, continues to be ruled by our emotions. You know, in theosophical circles, we use a lot of Sanskrit and we call it kama manas, kama meaning desire, manas meaning mind, the desire mind. I want, I want, I want. So much of our thinking continues to be controlled in this way. And so it's claimed by certain people that I've come across quite recently that only around 8% or so, give or take, of people in the world are in any way soul connected at the moment. It's believed that figure needs to rise in order for a certain quantum leap to take place. Now, I have to deal with the idea of conspiracy theories briefly. A lot of people think that anything that departs from the mainstream narrative is a conspiracy theory, but I'd like to actually point out that the phrase conspiracy theory was originally cooked up by America's FBI as a means of, well, basically discrediting people who knew too much or were dissidents of some mainstream acceptable truth. But the word conspiracy theory is leveled at all sorts of things against people who dare to dispute any part of the conventional narrative, even when that evidence is quite indisputable often. I would say that, yes, there are conspiracies in the world. Not everything is a conspiracy. I spent 55 years as a journalist and I have uncovered quite a few conspiracies myself. So they do exist, but we shouldn't overdo it, basically. But it's important to say that the prevailing views of most of the population at any time during our recorded history have often proved to be completely wrong when viewed in the future. For example, if in the 15th century you'd dared to assert that the Earth was round and spun on its axis once a day and went round the sun once every 365 days, you would have been regarded as a heretic, and you might even have been burnt at the stake for this. And this is despite the fact that the Greeks and the Babylonians, 2,000 years more than that before this, had known that we lived in a heliocentric or sun-centered solar system, and that the Earth definitely wasn't flat. So if you'd thought this at the time Christopher Columbus was setting off across the Atlantic, you would have been called a heretic and a conspiracy theorist. Indeed, Madame Blavatsky and her ideas and the Theosophical Society itself were, and still are to many people, heretical. They have views which are so far beyond what many people can accept that they are just dismissed as fantasy. But I think as theosophists, we should always be duty-bound to explore alternative points of view and retain as much freedom of thought as we can, because the nature of knowledge, the accumulation of knowledge is always changing, and I think we need to keep abreast of that as possible. My own personal definition of theosophy, for what it's worth, is that it does offer us structures and solutions which enable us to progressively, through our own, to quote Madame Blavatsky's phrase, self-devised efforts, which help us to evolve and free ourselves from our limitations. And these limitations are often self-imposed, or they're imposed by the thought which emerges from science or religion or other forms of dogma. To me, theosophy is a crucial evolutionary tool, but I do think we have to have open minds and the ability to express ourselves freely in order to do this. And this is often quite difficult in this modern era of a very censorious cancel culture. So we have to be very careful about these things. There seems to be a growing view that over the last few decades, we've seen a big shift in the nature of the world. And some people describe this almost as a progressive hijacking of the world and the seizure of its wealth and well-being by small controlling elites of people. And to me and to many others, these elites are the faces, the modern faces of the forces of darkness. We're going to come on to the forces of light and darkness in a while. And often during this time, they've been largely unopposed and indeed even welcomed by some, because as we've seen through history, being oppressed and being controlled makes some people actually feel secure. And this has become quite clear during the events of the last 2 or 3 years. And the evidence of this moving around of wealth and the seizure and control on many levels is quite overwhelming. And put it crudely, the rich are getting richer and the poor getting poorer. I mean, we're not getting into politics here, we're simply stating socio-economic facts. So these dark forces are making actually a determined last stand to ensure that they retain control and that they continue to have ultimate control over humanity. And all sorts of things emerge out of this which fog the issues. Climate emergencies, the threat of nuclear war, economic and medical crises are some of the means that these elites are accused of using. Whether that's true or not, I leave it up to you to decide, because we shouldn't believe anything anybody says. We should base it on our own judgment. We certainly do live in an age of digital domination, and there does seem to be some kind of global agenda for change, both for good and for the more sinister things as well. And basically, we find ourselves in a war. And this war is now playing out externally, but this war is thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. and it's been raging on the inner planes since the times of the destruction of Atlantis. And since these times, the dark forces, and by the dark forces, we mean those forces which strive to keep humanity imprisoned in basically the material world and deny the fact that they have any kind of spiritual dimension to them whatsoever. So these are the dark forces. That's what they want to do. They want to keep us where we are. And they've triumphed again and again and done their very best to frustrate humanity's attempts at spiritual realization and evolution. The good news is that they're not going to succeed. They're not going to succeed because the power of the human spirit and the powers of light are much greater than they are. And I do think that more and more people are becoming aware of this conflict, which plays out, as I say, externally and internally. Sadly, the situation to a lot of people at the moment looks very grave, and to some people it looks completely hopeless. And this is precisely what perhaps these forces want people to feel, because if you're exhausted, frightened, demoralized, isolated and broke, it makes it difficult to retain any kind of independence, especially independence of thought. So as chilling as it all seems right now, and certainly I've listened to a couple of lectures over the last 2 weeks looking at the astrological predictions over the next 2.5 years, and they certainly don't look very good. But as chilling as it all seems right now, this war will eventually end, and these dark forces will ultimately be defeated. And I can't stress that strongly enough. But we face right now not only the threats from these forces, but also the inevitable conflicts, which are the hallmarks of the transition from one age to another. We'll all be aware that we're somewhere in the transition point from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. Each of these ages lasts 2,160 years approximately, and there is a long changeover period between these ages. It doesn't just happen in a couple of days or a few weeks. It can last hundreds of years as this happens. So when the energies of the new age of Aquarius will actually come in, it's almost impossible to say, but I think we're almost at that point now. And because these two ages are so different, and the rubbing together of these opposing energies is also partly responsible for this conflict. So these turning points, whether they're of this cycle or others, always tend to be quite tumultuous and very often chaotic as the old order gives way to new structures. As theosophists, we understand this completely because we know that nothing ever stands still, even for the tiniest fraction of a second. Everything is always busy, evolving and becoming something else. Now, opposing the forces of darkness are what we'll call the forces of light on the inner planes, and what we theosophists describe, as I mentioned earlier, the Trans-Himalayan or Great White Brotherhood of masters and advanced beings. And they're continuing in a much more covert way their ages-old work of opposing the dark enemies. And their means are not only subtle, they're long-term and also, I believe, effective. But the situation's not going to change immediately. I do think there will be further upheavals before we see really positive developments. So imperceptibly, but inexorably, we're moving from an age of perhaps harsh logic into one where we once again may become subsumed by magic. That is, an understanding of nature's forces and the ability to use them for beneficial and non-selfish, exploitative purposes. We're talking strictly about white magic and not black magic. We'll return to this in a little while. So, who are these masters of wisdom, and what do we know about them? Well, they're said to be advanced adepts who are members of this Great White Lodge, which is also known by other names, and they feature extensively in the early theosophical literature, and they also feature elsewhere. There are many, many different versions of who these masters are, so we'll try and explore some of them this evening. This brotherhood was said to be formed long ago during the third root race, during Lemurian times, and they were formed to assist humanity evolve and to get smarter, become more spiritually adept people. So these brothers of light, or masters, constitute this hidden hierarchy of wise beings who basically shape this planet, not directly, but by influencing people and overshadowing certain individuals rather than by direct action. That's the way I understand it. I have to say at this point that belief in these advanced beings is by no means ubiquitous or universal, although they are said to have been pivotal in the forming of the Theosophical Society itself. Naturally, some people are very skeptical about their very existence, and indeed to some people they're purely fantasy figures based on fiction or some kind of wishful thinking. But for the sake of this talk, we'll assume that the masters or adepts are real, although not necessarily always in physical bodies. We understand that while they do and can assume physical form, they also utilize more subtle astral or other even higher vehicles to communicate with others, often many thousands of miles away. And if you read the life of Madame Blavatsky, which I'm doing at the moment in Sylvia Cranston's excellent biography of her, you'll see that certainly Madame Blavatsky was often influenced by these people, which we'll mention shortly, even when she was a long way away from them. Now, they're sometimes called Mahatmas, which is Sanskrit for great souls. And they represent this elite of the most spiritually evolved members of humanity. It might be worthwhile quoting Madame Blavatsky's own description of a Mahatma, which is a personage who, by special training and education, has evolved those higher faculties and has attained that spiritual knowledge which ordinary humanity will acquire after passing through numberless series of reincarnations during the process of cosmic evolution, which I think says it all. They're not masters by accident, they're masters because they have put in the effort and have accelerated their own development. And this is what theosophy is all about, a means of accelerating our own spiritual evolution, especially. So this hidden brotherhood is nothing like the anonymous and manipulative elites who attempt to dominate, own, and control the world today. The important point is that they are a spiritual elite, a highly developed and benevolent brotherhood presiding over the evolution of all kingdoms of nature on this planet: human, vegetable, mineral, and the three kingdoms below that on the etheric level. These masters often exist in the subtle realms, but are said to have the capacity to materialize in human bodies, or in what appear to be human bodies as the situation warrants it. And the word master itself can be misleading because it tends to suggest this idea of control. Well, they don't control other people in that sense. They are masters of no one except themselves. They have mastered the secrets of life, in other words. But one question often arises when we discuss these matters, and that is, if these advanced beings have such power and such influence, why don't these supposed guides of humanity step in and make the world a better place? Why don't they do something to dispel all this darkness which we find around us? And that's quite a legitimate question. I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that is, but standard response normally is that these masters can't intervene directly in human affairs, because if they were to do that, it would infringe our free will and would prevent us from dealing with the crisis that we've created ourselves. We have to find solutions to our own problems. And so therefore it would impede our evolution gained through struggle and dealing with difficulties, and it would probably infringe our collective karma. So it appears that these masters work in much more subtle ways by overshadowing individuals or sometimes groups of people and introducing certain new and often revolutionary ideas to them. They've been behind philanthropic movements, the trade union movement, thought movements, and all sorts of other things. Sometimes artistic and scientific ventures as well as other major developments. Well, what do we know about them? Much has been written about some of them, some of it wildly speculative and some of it no doubt inaccurate, but there is often a consensus there. And we're aware that certainly in theosophical circles, some of the masters have achieved much more prominence than others. And in particular, the most well known to us are the masters Moria, M, and Kuthumi, or Master KH. They communicated with various early members of the Theosophical Society and people associated with them. And they communicated by precipitating letters and other communications. These Mahatma letters are still there in the British Library, 1,300 pages of them. Now, they also had a very big influence on Madame Blavatsky, especially during the writing of her magnum opus, her great work, The Secret Doctrine. Madame Blavatsky first encountered Master Moria when she was a young woman of only around 20, and she was living in England, having fled her husband in Russia. And this was the time of the Great Exhibition. And this Master M is described as being a tall, imposing-looking and lavishly costumed Rajput prince riding a magnificent horse. And this is said to have taken place in Hyde Park during this exhibition. A less romantic version of this puts this meeting in Ramsgate, so I'll leave it up to you. And from that moment, Master M had a huge influence on Blavatsky's life and her development too. And he was to remain in close communication with her for the next 40 or so years until her death in 1891. And at this first meeting, Moria apparently urged Blavatsky to make the first of her visits to India. And she arrived there at the end of 1852 and stayed for 2 years. And this was a very pivotal time in her own development. But also Blavatsky during her life had extensive and regular contact with Kuthumi as well. He was also involved in many of her enterprises. These Mahatma letters, as they're known, were from Moria and Kuthumi, but there's also one from the Mahachohan, the head of the hierarchy, sometimes also known as the Lord of Civilization. And among the people they were sent to, I mean, the most famous of the Mahatma letter books are the letters to A.P. Sinnett, and Alan Hume from M and KH. As I say, there, some of them are stored in London's British Library. Now, intriguingly, little has been heard of Master M or KH since the late 19th century, and their whereabouts now is unknown. Whether they are still in physical incarnation or active, it isn't known. They disappeared really during the final years of the late 19th century and early years of the 20th century. The theosophical writer and artist Nicholas Roerich went on a tour of Tibet in the late 1920s, and he said that he found no trace of them or people who knew them, and nor did the French explorer Alexandre David Neil, who followed shortly afterwards. Now, when you read about Master M from various different sources, he's said to have had an illustrious roll call of incarnations, including Melchior, one of the three wise men, the biblical patriarch Abraham, King Arthur of Camelot, the English Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas à Becket, the English statesman Thomas More, and the Mughal Emperor Akbar. Well, I don't think you can improve on that as a CV, can you? It's understood also that KH has worked very closely in cooperation with Moria, almost as a unit for an extended period of time, possibly even a number of centuries. KH is said to have been educated at a British university. He's said to have been of Kashmiri origin and concerned himself with revitalizing various philosophies and working with philanthropic agencies. And his previous incarnations, if you believe this, are said to have included the Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras, a Magi priest from Persia, St. Francis of Assisi, and the Indian Emperor Shah Jahan. I'll leave you to be completely open-minded about this as to whether you accept this or not. Within and beyond theosophical circles, other masters are also mentioned. There's Dwaj Kul or DK, who inspired the writings of Alice Bailey, who to some theosophists is a very controversial figure. But others are mentioned here and there as well. The Master Jupiter, the Venetian Master, Master Serapis, and Master Hilarion. Master Hilarion is said to have formerly been Paul of Tarsus, and he's often described as a handsome Greek, and tends to occupy his time with scientific matters, but also in developing the intuition. And he was said to have been responsible for stimulating the work of psychical research groups from the 19th century onwards. Another frequently mentioned master, mainly outside the theosophical orbit, is the Master Rakotsi, who's described as the regent for Europe and works on the seventh ray of ceremonial order and magic. And this seventh ray is the synthesizing ray of the new Aquarian age. And Rakotsi's previous incarnations are said to include St. Alban, the philosopher Proclus, the English monk Roger Bacon, Christian Rosenkreutz, and the 17th century English polymath Francis Bacon. But his last incarnation is often said to have been that of an enigmatic Hungarian prince, Count de Saint-Germain, and he's said to have inhabited this body for a very prolonged period of time. Another high-ranking figure is the English master, who is sometimes named as the poet Robert Browning. But of course, along with these, there are people openly working in the world in all sorts of spiritual traditions, highly advanced people who do have a huge influence on this planet. Principally, you would think of someone as, say, the 14th Dalai Lama, who's widely recognized by both Tibetan Buddhists and others as one of humanity's most important spiritual leaders. Some believe him to be the 74th incarnation of Buddha. And he's indicated, I believe, that he may be the last in the line of Dalai Lamas. So these days, the internet is full of supposed channelings by mysterious terrestrial and cosmic beings, and there seem to be more ascended masters these days than members of the Chinese army. And how many of these communications are bona fide, I'll leave you to decide, because the situation is often very, very confusing. Another very widespread idea within and indeed outside religions involves various predictions of a new avatar or savior or Christ-like figure who may help guide humanity out of its periodic crises and towards a better and presumably a more spiritually orientated future. Many mainstream Christians firmly believe in the reappearance of Jesus in some form. Others refer more generally to the re-emergence of not Jesus, but the Christ. The Hindu tradition speaks of a line of avatars who are all incarnations of the god Vishnu, the preserver and the protector. He's part of the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And it's said that each avatar appears when the world is jeopardized by chaos, sin, or evil. And so far, there have apparently been 9 of these avatars, and the 10th and final incarnation, known as the Kalki, or the mighty warrior, is due to appear at some unspecified time at the end of the present dark age we're said to be living in, the Kali Yuga. Other people have predicted the reappearance or the appearance of a high adept known as Maitreya. Some of you may be familiar with the Scottish artist, writer, and esoteric thinker Benjamin Creme, who died in 2016. Again, he was quite a controversial figure and used to hold lectures in London. And he spent much of his life speaking about a highly evolved individual of that name who moved to London from the Indian subcontinent in 1977 and settled in the East End. And Creme claimed that Maitreya had made a number of limited public appearances and even appeared on television in various countries, but it was all very vague. Creme said that for various reasons, he wasn't yet ready to go public. And the reason for this, according to Benjamin Creme, was that the public wasn't ready to receive him. And there are, of course, numerous different predictions of the appearance of messiahs in other traditions as well. Okay. We're going to move on to this idea, and this is by no means universally accepted by people, but I think it's an interesting idea and I think it's worth throwing into the mix. And this is the supposed conclave of masters at the Council of Shambhala, a crucially significant meeting which takes place in the 25th year of every century. Shambhala, as you'll be aware, is said to exist somewhere in the remotest regions of the Himalayas, maybe Mongolia, maybe Tibet. According to some, though, it's no longer in any kind of physical form, but exists purely on the etheric levels, the etheric being the higher part of the physical spectrum, a spectrum not yet accepted by science. The last gathering of this conclave took place in 1925, which was, of course, in the aftermath of World War I. And here it's said that a number of important developments took place. The first was the founding of a group of so-called conditioning souls, known as the New Group of World Service. And this was intended as a network of spiritually minded people of goodwill working cooperatively to promote global enlightenment. As well as linking individuals and various spiritual organizations, its aim was also to implement a number of other initiatives and to promote such things as the will to good, right human relationships, brotherhood, which is what we believe in theosophy, service to humanity, and unity. It's also claimed that at this 1925 meeting of the Masters, the hierarchy shifted gear for the first time in 12,000 years. And by this, we mean that they moved their operations, or sometimes as it's referred to, their ashrams, from the mental to the Buddhic plane. That is the realm of wisdom, intuition, a state of consciousness above the higher mental. We're also told that one of the things which also happened after this is that there was another key development in the way that humanity was going. And there is something called the dweller on the threshold, the collective darkness of the world, the accumulated negative karma of humanity. And it's said that after the Second World War, this shifted its focus from Germany to the United States. This is an important development because prior to 1941, when the United States entered the Second World War, it had been a steadfastly non-interventionist nation. It didn't want to repeat what had happened in World War I, and it had only a relatively small military. Well, if you look at it today, it has hundreds, thousands of military bases in virtually all the countries of the earth. Now, I'm saying this because the widely held view is that these conflicts of the 20th century were a recapitulation, a rerun of those bitter wars in Atlantean times, when the Atlanteans split into two different groups: the lords of the dark face, the reactionary forces of materialism and anti-spirituality, who were said to have tried to manipulate matter and do all sorts of other things, and their opponents in Atlantis, the lords of the shining face or shining countenance. And this dividing of the Atlanteans into two groups in conflict with one another is said to have been one of the key causes of the destruction of Atlantis. And many believe the effects of that conflict never ended, and they actually are still continuing today. And I'll leave it for you to decide who, if any, the Lords of Darkness are in the modern era. We need to talk a little bit about conflict and war, because the First World War mistakenly was said to be the war to end all wars, but it wasn't. It just set the template for even bloodier conflicts. The Second World War may have ended in 1945, but immediately the Iron Curtain descended across Europe and the Cold War unfolded. There was then the Korean War, colonial conflicts involving Britain and other European nations, the Vietnam War, the First Gulf War, forays into Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Been a war going on in the Congo since the Belgians left in 1960, and numerous other lesser conflicts. And so it seems that we've had continuous armed conflict almost since 1914. And at no time during that period have the arms manufacturers ever had empty order books. Now, at this forthcoming conclave in 2025, it's speculated by some that the key topic for discussion will be the first stage of the reappearance of these masters and their direct involvement with humanity. And this is sometimes known as the externalization of the hierarchy, and the first time it's occurred for many thousands of years. And apparently the hierarchy originally withdrew from the physical plane because of those raging Atlantean wars and the subsequent cataclysms. This conclave will apparently determine the timing of this reappearance, whether it's a few years or a few decades. But it's said to present these masters, who often operate outside the physical plane, with enormous difficulties because they then have to deal with the coarse vibrations which we find on the physical plane, and it's said to be a demanding and uncomfortable process. But also other conditions are said to have to take place. Firstly, humanity has to accept that we are essentially souls occupying physical bodies. Most people don't believe that. Secondly, that there is such a thing as this hidden hierarchy. And third, that there is some kind of divine plan, even if we don't know exactly what that plan is. So has humanity adequately fulfilled these conditions? Well, there's no way of knowing this, but judging by world affairs, by human behavior, and the dominance currently of materialism, one could be forgiven for being somewhat skeptical as to whether that will happen. And needless to say, the dark forces which predominate at the time will do probably everything in their power to oppose all this. So humanity's collective psyche, and the world does have a collective mental body, seems to be vital in determining events. How many people are prepared to wake up to the stark realities and begin resisting these plans of the shadow legions is impossible to calculate, and it may be extremely difficult. However, one thing that we can be assured of is that the power of white magic is much greater than that of black magic. So to wind up, this brings us to another important, interesting, and widely predicted development. And this is the eventual revival of the mystery schools of old. Many writers have written about this, and I've read a number of their books with great interest. Of course, these ancient mystery schools thrived for many millennia across the planet in such places as Egypt and Greece and Babylon, the Middle East, Chaldea, throughout Vedic India and the Himalayas, and in Europe and also in South America. The pyramids, Stonehenge, the ruined Greek temples which hosted these schools are testimony to their power and influence. In ancient Greece, the mystery schools effectively created what we now know as theatre, and this was an early means of distributing and explaining key esoteric ideas when presented in dramatic form, in comedies and tragedies, and this was a means of informing the masses of basic truths. The central role of all these mystery schools in all the locations was to focus on death and the awakening of the soul. And via ritual and other means, they provided detailed route maps for personal spiritual evolution, transformation, and enlightenment. And in some cases, these psychodramas were highly elaborate, persuasive, and often quite lengthy. A candidate, for example, could find themselves placed in a stone sarcophagus for 3 days, enacting or reenacting some kind of post-mortem journey. Sometimes hallucinogenic drugs in some traditions were used to enhance the reality of these lengthy symbolic death journeys. Although some of these schools were often aimed chiefly at the elites and the influential members of the society, the Greek mysteries were open to a great many citizens. In Greece, the philosopher Plato, the mathematician Pythagoras, and the historian Herodotus all passed through the portals of the mystery schools. All of them, without exception, had and demanded a binding oath of secrecy about the knowledge that they imparted, and anyone revealing the secrets to the profane or the initiated, or people who strayed into their private precincts, were often punished by death. In Greece and elsewhere, the mysteries were divided into two divisions, the lesser and the greater. The lesser were aimed at neophytes and involved in preparing the candidate for the path they would take via study and a close focus on physical and emotional purification. The greater mysteries were for more advanced candidates and emphasized the idea of consciously accelerating one's development so that those involved regard themselves as evolving and awakening souls, all part of the one life. And all this involved the study of many esoteric teachings and secrets. We're told that the European mystery schools finally closed their doors by the 3rd or 4th centuries. In 396 AD, the last of the Greco-Roman mystery schools was destroyed by the invading Goths. And then the knowledge that they transmitted went silently underground, possibly revived in diluted form by such groups as the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and maybe others too. Whether these mystery schools really vanished altogether or were preserved in some more intact form, I think is a matter of conjecture. But in recent times, quite a range of people have proposed that the updated and rejuvenated schools are destined to appear. But this time they will be slightly different. They wouldn't just focus on personal change, but would focus on planetary change to create a world of greater compassion, love, and universal spirituality. And it's been suggested quite interestingly that these schools could be sited in locations strongly associated with their historic predecessors and may be connected to important historical monuments, ancient temples, or other places of initiation. And the core aim of all of them is the evolution of the soul. So perhaps rather than each of them being isolated institutions, they could form part of a global network. And it's said that these new equivalents would probably have the same equivalents of the lesser and greater mysteries. The lesser for people starting out on that path, and the greater ones for perhaps bigger work, reconciling our lower selves with our higher selves, and generally trying to create a world of purpose and creativity. Perhaps this revival is already underway in various clandestine settings and still shrouded in secrecy, and maybe there will be a gradual re-emergence. Or perhaps unknown and indeed unpredictable events or necessity itself may somehow stimulate their reappearance. But this network of mystery schools certainly won't replace conventional religions in the short term, although they may have some influence and even modify them over time. So one day in the very distant future, humanity may have evolved to the point of not requiring religions at all to confirm their spiritual identity. But having said that, we will all have reincarnated many, many more times before this actually becomes a reality. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll wind up there, and if anybody has any